Welcome back and thank you for staying with us on The Conversation. Now, Donald Trump's return to the U.S. presidency has sparked cautious anticipation and also uncertainty in Africa. His previous remarks about Africa and promises during the 2024 campaign have also raised concerns. But despite this, Trump's administration might not entirely ignore Africa, but instead use a different approach to interact with the continent. The U.S. may strengthen trade and economic ties with Africa to counterbalance Russia and China's growing influence. Now, a potential strategy is to use bilateral free trade as well. That's the agreements to foster collaboration. And this could benefit nations like Nigeria, strategically positioned for global trade. However, harsh treatment from the U.S. may drive African countries towards China and Russia for support, highlighting the need for mutually beneficial strategies. But the question here is, will Trump's administration prioritize Africa's interests and aspirations, or will its policies drive the continent further into the orbit of rival global powers? Now, joining us on The Conversation today, we have Professor X.N. Iraki. He's an economist, University of Nairobi in Kenya. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you, and have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon. All right, so let's begin with, now Trump has actually talked about imposing big tariffs, like a 10% tax on imports and also possibly up to 60% on goods from China. How do you think that these policies would affect Africa, especially when it comes to, exports or the cost of doing business with the U.S.?
If you listen to Donald Trump's or President Trump's inaugural speech yesterday, he never talked about Trump. He never talked about tariffs. And if you look at the executive orders he came up with, tariffs were not there. So that makes me believe that he is using tariffs to threaten, to make countries make certain policy changes, not really to impose them. Because if he imposes tariffs as he has put, 10%, 60%, or 25%, it is going to have a very negative impact on trade. Not just with America, but with our neighbors. Remember that trade is bilateral. You export something, you import something. So I believe that Trump is threatening tariffs, but I think in reality he's not going to implement that. The good thing is America doesn't have a lot of trade with Africa. So even if he implements those tariffs, they will not significantly affect Africa. A lot of African countries like Kenya have diversified their trading partners. And that's probably a good strategy to make sure that if he comes up with such strategies, it will not be as effective, it will not be as devastating as expected.
But Africa also trade with China, a lot of African countries, and if, the tariffs, are imposed on China, then it will indirectly impact Africa.
It's even interesting that last year, as Trump is talking about imposing tariffs on China, China was talking about removing tariffs on 33 African countries that are low income. So I know that there will be indirect effect on Africa because of China getting tariffs.
Of course.
But at the end of the day, we should not be talking about tariffs at this age. That was the age of mercantilism. We should be talking about free trade. Because any trade war through tariffs and so on, everybody loses. So I think what Trump should be telling us in Africa, in China and everywhere, is not to threaten with tariffs, but ask how do we make free trade? How do we make sure that trade flows between countries? How do we make sure that Africa gets money from trade more than foreign aid? That should be the debate.
All right, well, we'll still discuss more on, trade and African economies. But then, how likely is it that Africa's push for democracy and good governance could be undermined if Trump continues to cozy up to authoritarian leaders, as he did with President Putin and Kim Jong-un in his first term?
I think that is everybody's nightmare scenario that Trump may end up becoming costly with countries that are not democratic, that don't espouse democratic ideas like China, like South Korea, and others. But I think what has happened in Africa in the last 10 or so years is that China has made very good inroads in terms of investments, in terms of foreign aid, in terms of cultural investments. If you look at things like Confucius Institutes. And I think because of that, not China, but U.S. will be very reluctant to be very hostile trade-wise, economically on Africa. Because once you become hostile on Africa, African countries are going to naturally move towards China. We have seen what is happening in Sahel when countries are abandoning France and going for the Russian influence. So I think one of the things that I suspect Trump is going to do is to make sure that African countries move towards the US orbit, not towards Russia, not towards China. And I think that is wrong overdue.
Okay, but then, there's inflation everywhere. And if inflation in the U.S. keeps rising, and interest rates are actually raised, what does it mean for African countries that depend on trade with the U.S. or even rely on borrowing from American markets?
In fact, a bigger concern is that if interest keep on going up in the U.S., then our currencies are going to become weaker. Or there's going to be a very big impact on the exchange rate. So I think at the end of the day, whatever happens in the US, and that's why we are having this discussion here, has an impact in Kenya, has impact in Nigeria, has impact in other African countries, and has impact even in China and Russia. And I know President Donald Trump is a big disruptor. But I think why he is going to be very soft is because at the end of the day, there will be inflation in the US, and that is going to have political implications. All economists will tell you that if you raise tariffs, then there will be inflation in the US. And I think once the US starts suffering from inflation, that is going to be exported to other countries. And I'm sure he's going to come back and say, wait a minute, I cannot suffer this political cost because of inflation. Let's talk. Let's reduce tariffs. Let's talk about free trade. And I think politics, what politicians say and what happens on the ground are two different things.
All right. Now, I know earlier, Professor Iraki, you did talk about, we talked about if interests were raised or, if tariffs were increased and all that. Now, let's talk about, let's not even deny the fact that Trump has a confrontational stance towards China and Russia. And if this stance continues, there's a high possibility that African countries will be caught in the middle, of a new Cold War style rivalry. So how can or how should African diplomats or, African countries prepare for that?
That's my biggest concern, because if I look at countries like Canada, if I look at European Union, if I look at China, those countries have been preparing for Trump too. But I'm not sure of the aim of a concerted African effort to deal with the new Trump or with Trump too. So I think at the time African countries come together, whether it is ECOWAS, whether it's African Union, whether it's African Free Trade Area, whether it is East African region, the time they came together and came up with a common strategy how to contain the economic policies that Trump is coming up with. Because if they don't do that, I'm sure they are going to suffer. So the way other countries are preparing is the same we should prepare. Because I am sure Donald Trump or President Donald Trump is to come up with policies that are detrimental to the African economies. And we are better off if we can act together rather than acting fragmented country by country.
Now, speaking of, economic policies that Donald Trump is actually coming up with, he's actually pushing for reshoring and friendshoring. Could African countries potentially benefit from U.S. companies that are relocating some of their supply chains to the continent? Or do you think that, they will be left in the lurch as companies would focus more on keeping things closer to home, which is, America?
Donald Trump, from his first term up the start to the current term, he has been talking about America first. And one of the reasons why he did very well in the first term is he stopped offshoring. He was telling American companies, instead of manufacturing in Vietnam, in China and elsewhere, why don't you come home? Why don't you come and have these jobs at home? That was very popular. But bringing companies home is not as easy as it sounds. You have to get a whole plant. You have to get lower wages. And American companies go abroad, go to China, go to Vietnam, go to Africa, because the costs are lower. And just because you want companies come home does not mean that the costs are going to be low in the US. So it's not at least that sounds. I think the idea of stopping offshoring, the idea of bringing American companies home is not going to take place overnight. It's going to take a long period of time. And what African countries should do is to market themselves as low-cost countries to replace Vietnam, to replace China, and so on. If we can have good infrastructure, good power, very high level of human resources, then we can be an alternative to those countries and diplomatically entice American companies to come and invest in Africa.
All right, Professor Iraki. Now, let's talk about, Trump's history of criticizing NATO and also his antagonism towards allies. Could African countries find themselves, without allies, or could they find themselves without the support or the need from the U.S. in addressing critical issues like, peacekeeping, human rights, or even security challenges?
That is very unlikely to happen, because I can assure you, in the last 10 years or so, China has been making very big inroads into Africa. Whether you go to Ghana, whether you go to Kenya, whether you go to DRC or any African country, China has been investing. Not just diplomatically, it has also been investing structurally, infrastructure, culturally. We have seen Confucius Institutes coming up in Kenya and other countries. So if the US gets away from Africa, China is there. And I think that is good enough reason why America is unlikely to turn away from African countries, because somebody else will take over. I said earlier, even Russia is coming. Russia is in Sahel. Russia is involved in a lot of political and military conflicts in Africa. So if America gets away from those responsibilities, the other countries are waiting to come in. Turkey is there. European, one of the Gulf countries, I think it is UAE, is also very actively involved in African countries. So if America walks away, the other people waiting on the wings, and that's unlikely.
Well, you seem to have so much faith and trust in Donald Trump as regards to, or as opposed to every other person or every other analyst.
I think I don't think I have a lot of faith in Donald Trump as you put it. I think my argument is every politician, what the politician sees and what the politician's done on the ground are usually different. Remember, politicians say very many things to get votes. But one is they go to the White House. Once they go to State House, things change, dynamics change, and I expect that to change. And I also expect I expect to hear from you that apart from dealing with countries, dealing with governments, I saw some Nigerian preachers coming to the White House, so that Donald Trump is also eager to go to the heart of Africa, also to religion, because they are very religious.
But shouldn't Africans begin to think of themselves, away from, every other continent, and think of how to, grow their own continent and focus on themselves more, rather than rely on other continents?
That's what everybody has been arguing, that we need to make sure that African Union can talk in one voice. We make sure that African free trade area is actualized, so that when we go to bargain with the US, with Canada, we go to bargain with Russia, we go to bargain with every country, we talk of Africa, we talk in one voice. That one we should be able to get a better bargain. So maybe historically we can go back to Pan-Africanism and revive it, not just from political angle, but from trade, from development, from investment perspective. I think that will make a difference to our continent.
Well, I speak of Africa focusing on themselves because, even Trump has the American first policy, and it has often been tough on multilateral agreements. Now, do you think that there is a risk that U.S. trade agreements with Africa like the AGOA could be reviewed or even undermined?
I have no doubt that if you listen to what Trump is saying from the White House, the conversation he is having, I'm almost sure he's going to review some of those trade agreements, AGOA and others, multilaterally and unilaterally. And that's why I argued earlier that African countries should have a position on Trump. They should not just be taking off guard. They should be having a position in terms of negotiating with Donald Trump on trade as blocs, as African Union, as African Free Trade Area, as individuals. Because if we don't have a policy, we don't have a position, I'm sure we are going to be losers.
Absolutely. But then how do you think that, these trade agreements, if they are reviewed, would hurt African economies?
I think I've always argued that at the end of the day, any trade agreement should not be about raw materials. It should be about value addition. It should be about industrializing Africa. It should be about making sure that Africa becomes self-reliant. Because for a long time, we have been exporters of raw materials. We have been importers of finished products, machineries, and so on. But if you look at how China developed, how Japan developed, how Southeast Asia developed, they moved beyond raw materials and started manufacturing. So whatever people say, we must do some manufacturing. If we don't do that, we have always been on the receiving end.
So, you talked about, Africa being self-reliant. Now, if the new presidency decides to double down on, the Africa or America first approach that he leaned on heavily on isolationism, how could it change the way that African countries navigate their relationships with global powers like China and Russia? Because there are talks that, Russia is actually beginning to infiltrate some of the African countries.
I think charity starts at home. Before we think about the power, before we think about the US, before we think of Russia, we should think about what we can do for ourselves. When I come to West Africa, I always hear of ECOWAS. You even have common exams in high school. But how much trade do you have among yourselves? East African community is on the other side of the continent. We have SADC. We have other continental bodies. So before we think of how to deal with Russia, to deal with China and so on, we must put our houses in order. I think Africa has been fragmented for too long. So if we need to start talking one voice in terms of matters of trade, in matters of investment, in matters of attracting tourism, that is going to make a difference. We have been divided for too long. It's time we started talking in one voice.
So now Trump's first term actually saw, major tax cuts, hence the fear, and also deregulation. But we all know that the global economy looks very different now, with wider debt levels and inflation. So will his usual fiscal strategies still work?
I think that's a big question, because one of the things that has surprised all economists is Donald Trump saying he won't have more control over the Federal Reserve, over the monetary and fiscal policies. So as he has a say on who reads the federal government, or who reads not the federal government, but who reads the Federal Reserve. So his fiscal policies need new ways of engaging readers, of engaging central banks, of engaging economics, because he's actually very disruptive. And that's why I was saying African countries should have come up with a Trump strategy. How do you do such disruptive tariffs, disruptive policies that nobody thought about? So I think he is going to be disruptive, but I think it's also a time for Africans to start examining the policies they have been using, how effective they have been, and how effective they are going to be in a new socio-political economic order.
How disruptive, if you can explain further, will these strategies actually be?
You see, if you talk to any economist, he'll tell you that tariffs were used in maybe 100 years ago. But now Donald Trump is talking about tariffs. If you look at African Free Trade Area, one of the objectives, if you look at ECOWAS, if you look at East African Community, if you look at European Union, all of them have been working towards reducing tariffs. So when somebody comes and says, let's not reduce tariffs, let's increase tariffs, that is disruptive. So we don't know, we are coming up with a high tariff regime when you're supposed to come up with low tariff regime. And when now you bring politics there, where Donald Trump is saying, I want to increase tariffs to protect the American market. And what he's not saying directly is, I want to protect the American market, American voters, so that we can get more votes in future. So when you let politics override economics, that is disruptive.
All right. Now, Professor Iraki, now still talking about, President Trump's approach, especially to global governance, which has often been to sidestep institutions, like the UN. If he continues this pattern, what does that mean for Africa's voice? From last year, during summits and events, globally, Africans have actually come out to say that, Africa needs to be given a voice. We need to stand firm because we are the ones with the resources and all that. So what does it mean for Africa's voice and influence in global decision-making spaces?
I was very surprised to see that one of the executive orders that Donald Trump came up with was to withdraw from World Health Organization. If you look at how World Health Organization dealt with a crisis like COVID-19, if you look at major crises that we have faced, peacekeeping, wars in Gaza, wars in Ukraine, and so on, such multilateral organizations have been very central. So if you now withdraw from multilateral organizations and let individual countries act, then Africa is going to be very disadvantaged, because through these multilateral organizations, UN, African Free Trade Area, WHO, and so on, Africa is able to have a voice. I even remember Africa being invited as an observer to G7, G20, and so on. So if you remove those multilateral organizations, then African voice will not be heard. And that's why I'm going back and saying that African countries must think of post or Trump 2 strategy to see how to deal with these disruptive policies, these disruptive withdrawals. He's even withdrawing from the Paris Accord, probably.
Yeah.
So then what are we going to do with things like climatic change? And yet climatic change affects all of us. Whether you produce pollution or not, we are affected by that. And that's why I'm insisting we must come up with a strategy to deal with the disruptive policies from President Donald Trump.
Oh, okay. Now, Professor Iraki, would actually take a quick break now. When we come back in a short while, the show will continue. Do stay with us. Welcome back and thank you for staying with us on The Conversation. Now, we have been having discussions with Professor Exen Iraki, an economist, on President Donald Trump's second term and how, it would actually affect the African continent. And we have joining us also Abraham Great. He's a public affairs analyst in Canada at the moment. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Great.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Sorry I had to rush in today.
It's fine. Now, I'm sure you've actually heard, a few things that we have actually discussed between myself and Professor Iraki. He has said so much. He has touched on economy. He has touched on, trade and the likes. So go ahead and share with us your thoughts on the second term of President Donald Trump and how it will impact Africa.
A few things come to mind. I'm sorry I wasn't able to listen into your earlier conversation, but a few things come to mind for me that are important. One is for African countries to understand that the global politics is a game of chess. The moving parts affect other parts. What is happening in Nigeria is not as consequential as what is happening in America, but what is happening in Ukraine is so consequential to the effect of what happened for the rest of Africa. So how Nigeria plays itself in the global scheme of game affects a lot of what Nigeria become. The second thing I want us to realize is that 4 years will come and go so quickly. So it is important for the leaders of Nigeria to make the right decision, but also not to panic in terms of what will Trump do or not do. You just going to see 4 years will pass on just like this. So now this is a very good opportunity for Nigeria to position itself as a global leader from African perspective. This is a time for Nigeria to rise above I'll say the politics of behind, leading from the behind. There's no way and there's no reason why South Africa should be taking the lead in Africa, where Nigeria, with the economy of scale, can actually take its place as the giant of Africa. So Nigeria needs to be decisive. Nigeria also has to be incisive. Nigeria has to be, very focused on building its own economy from within. I mean, for example, looking at the example of China, no matter what America does, its policy does not affect China a great deal. Because China, although exports a lot, everything that China does or produces, it has enough economy within itself to prosper.
Okay. Well, you talked about, you made mention of China, but then Goldman Sachs and UBS, both say that a second Trump term could hurt Chinese growth. But how does that ripple out, to African economies that rely on trade with China, especially for things like infrastructure and also resources?
Another thing that Africa needs to pay attention to is that we need to move away from the textbook approach to our economy or to our solutions. You have to understand that institutions like Goldman Sachs, institutions like the IMF, even institutions, research bodies like Harvard, Yale, and stuff like that. I'm very academically inclined and research inclined. And you have to understand that Western nations, for over the centuries, have built conducive narrative to shape. Remember I said that the global economy is a game of chess. So there's nothing stopping Goldman Sachs or stopping all the multinational organizations from creating, sustainable development goals and stuff like that, and creating theories in favor of their agenda. I am not a proponent of President Donald Trump, but in the last 2 or 3 days, 2 days that he's been on, I'm beginning to like some of his stuff because he's quite, he has personal autonomy. And Nigeria particularly, and the rest of Africa, has to be autonomous. We've got to be able to make our own decision, not based on what Goldman Sachs says. We've got to invest in our own research and development, that we develop our economy not based on speculative approach of the West. Because these things may lead us astray if we have to go by what. It does not mean that we will condemn everything that they're saying, but what they are saying in itself should become an hypothesis for us to be able to derive our own serendipity. We've got to break through. We've got to break the yoke of the West from our neck. And one of the ways we have to do that is to break our borders. There should be a lot more unity and bilateral relationship within the African countries itself to be self-sustaining. Stop looking up to the West. Yeah. And you can see this with what Donald Trump is trying to do. He's trying to claim Canada. He wants to, bring Canada over, get Palmer. What is he looking for? He's looking for expansion. There is oil in Canada. There's oil in Panama. He's trying to look at more reasons why he doesn't even need any part of the world. He doesn't need Russia. He doesn't need Africa. That's what he's trying to achieve. Africa also has to do in a way that we don't need to export. Yes, we know that we need export to be able to increase our GDP or to increase our foreign reserve or to improve our currency, but that is not the only solution. We can become self-serving. We can become a lot more autonomous and feed ourselves, learning particularly from Singapore, learning from South Korea, learning from China.
Okay. Now, Mr. Great, just before we come back to you, Professor Iraki, let me just ask Mr. Great one more question. Now, Trump has been openly skeptical about, climate change and rolled back many environmental regulations. So what is the likelihood of him pulling out of the Paris Agreement? Professor Iraki did mention a bit about that. What is the, likelihood of him pulling out of this Paris Agreement again, or even continuing to roll back U.S. support for climate change financing and also global green energy projects?
One of the things that you will notice about the temperament of the second term Trump presidency, while he is still very firm and I don't want to use some negative adjective to describe him, while he's still the Trump that we know, you can see a little bit of calmness and humility. It also could suggest that his approach to things like climate change will maybe be softer than before. But if you listen to his campaign rhetorics and what he's been saying in the last 2 days, you realize that he's still maintaining nearly the same stance. He does not believe largely in climate change. But while he may be acting with a lot of executive order, don't forget that many of the moves he's making will still need legislative approval. So things like climate change will be, I don't think it will be able to just remove the funding for climate change or pull the US completely out without the involvement of the legislature. So we need to see when the Senate seats and to have a more broader look of how America is going to shape up, not only from the executive branch, but to see what the temperament of the legislature is going to be in America before we start making, final determinant of how it's going to play out.
All right. Now, Professor Iraki, still speaking on, climate change and rolling back on many environmental regulations by Donald Trump, how would it affect the African countries already battling the impacts of climate change like droughts and floods?
I think the first thing to notice is that the reason why President Donald Trump is very eager to talk less about the climatic change is because it is profitable. If you let companies pollute, if you have less stringent climatic mitigation measures, then companies make a lot of money because it is expensive to control pollution, it's expensive to control climatic change. And that's why the stock markets are here. But the problem is the African countries are already suffering from climatic change. If I give you an example of the village where I grew up, nobody knows when it is going to rain. I was in Ghana 2 weeks ago, and I was asking about the Hamilton, and they're telling me Hamilton is coming later or earlier than expected. So Africa has already had its problem even before the climatic change. So if that is not taken care of because Donald Trump is saying climatic change is not real, all this global warming are not important, then Africa is going to be disproportionately affected by climatic change. So I think as Donald Trump withdraws from such global initiatives, Africans, I agree with my colleague here, must come with own measures, with own mitigating measures. And I've already said charity starts at home. American problems are not our problems. They might be global in terms of climatic change. They might be same in terms of pollution, but we're not affected the same. That's why Africa must always think about its own strategy, its own solution. Because once we rely too much on other people's solution, once something goes wrong, we are on the receiving end.
Well, he has also pushed for more domestic fossil fuel production, and I would also like to know if you think it would affect African oil and gas exporters, like Angola, Nigeria, who could actually see their markets shrink or even face price fluctuations.
Oh, that definitely the rules of economics come in. If U.S. produces more petrol, produces more oil, produces more gas, then the supply of oil, the supply of gas in the world goes up. So the price of oil, the price of gas in Nigeria will go down. The price of oil in the Middle East will go down. So countries like Nigeria, countries like Angola that produce a lot of oil would have very serious financial difficulties, very serious budget deficits. So the drilling that Trump is talking about will eventually be felt in Nigeria and other oil-producing countries. No question about that.
Okay. Now, coming back to you, Mr. Great. Now, Trump's earlier attempts, to pull the U.S. out of the World Health Organization were deeply controversial, at the time. If he follows through with that decision again, how could that hurt Africa's health systems? I'm talking about, countries that are dealing with HIV, malaria, and also potentially new epidemics or pandemics.
My thought here is going to be slightly philosophical because agencies like the World Health Organization maybe started with a good intention, but you have to understand that those organizations they've been heavily lobbied for private agendas. Again, every research is with a notion. There is a theory out there that does not even believe that some of these things like AIDS exist, that maybe is a hookup or made up. There are theories around epidemic. There are theories around pandemics. There are theories around cancer. This is a golden opportunity for Africans to institutionalize the remedies from Africa to the rest of the world. And guess what? Avenues are already there for Africans to try. For example, in most part of Africa, or in many parts of Africa right now, people are developing herbal solutions to many ailments, and they are able to sell on Amazon. There is nothing stopping Africa from developing a stronger body that regulates, like, again, I'm going to refer to China, that in China, you don't only depend on the traditional medicine. You also have alternative medicine. You have acupuncture. You have different kind of things that are traditional to China, but they have now been entrenched. They have been exported to many parts of the world. So we still have these things and remedy that exist in Uganda, that exist in Ghana, in Nigeria, that we can put a lot more resources into into that, and then we can counter the World Health Education with not just theories and not just conspiracy, but with empirical data to say, you know what, we don't need to depend on you as the source. We have done this research, we have found this solution. We need to demegalize the dependency on the pharmaceutical companies around the world. I'll tell you this, in the generation that we now live, people will live longer. And the theories and the statistics are out there because people are now beginning to realize that they don't need to depend on pharmaceutical, and there's a lot of natural resources from all over the world, not just from Africa, from all over the world
Mr.
that
Griggs,
provide
yes.
solution to human ailment.
Mr.
So
Griggs,
Africa needs to stamp its foot on those research.
in reducing dependency, you know, what about the effect? Because I did ask the same question to the Professor Iraki earlier. How would, you know, the whole, speaking of the fossil fuel production and, you know, energy policies, how could it, you know, shift global energy landscape, especially for countries like Nigeria, Angola? Is it possible for these U.S. policies, you know, to lower the demand, you know, for African oil, or could it spur investment in African energy sectors, especially in minerals like lithium and cobalt?
If you look in the last 600 years, there has been a lot of variations in the movement of the economy around the world. And the current dependence on fossil fuel was predicted to be over by 2020. If you read the mindset of people that, you know, you read books like Startup Nations and stuff like that, even people like the Tesla owner, Elon Musk, they all predicted that by 2020, the whole world will be living, you know, using electric cars. We're not there yet. In most part of the world, there's not even up to 6% of electric cars that are being used in Canada or in the US at the moment. Africa, I mean, because our focus today is on Africa, how we react to these policies from America and the rest of the global organization. We have not to panic. We've got to realize that the trend of the world evolvement or revolution, there are indications that Africa is going to play a huge role in global leadership between now and the next 50 to 60 years. And there is nothing like us taking an autonomous stance to be self-sufficient and look at issue from our own perspective. I'll give you a clear example. They're saying that there will be a reduction on fossil fuel, but at the same time, America wants to have more crude, they want to have more land, they want to have more. But in Nigeria, let's assume that there is less reduction on fuel. But we have coal, for example. I've been trying to find a logistical framework to be able to supply coal, and I found that nearly in all of Africa, I'm on a project at the moment, and we found that nearly in all of Africa, there is no way you could supply coal directly to many parts of the world. The reason is because the infrastructural framework to be able to take coal to the rest of the world are not there.
Wow.
So you see that our local refineries like Dangote, like Rexy, they are the one consuming our coal right now.
Okay.
But the economy is there. Most of the refineries around the world, power plants around the world, even if they would not need fuel from us, they're going to need our coal. They're going to need our gas. This is a time for us to step up our logistics, step up our road networks in our nations. There should be a train from every state, from every place where we have landmass for agriculture, so that the produce and mineral resources can be taken directly on cargo line into our different ports, and we can export that to the rest of the world, not carrying containers, everywhere and, causing accidents on the road. Our fuel can move instead of fuel tankers moving on the road. This is a time to industrialize Africa. This is a time to look at Nigeria and build great road network, rail network, build infrastructure that will allow us to be able to distribute ourselves to the rest of the world. We have not tapped the surface yet.
All right. Now, let's hear your final thoughts, Professor Iraki, just before we wrap up. Quickly, please.
I have two comments to make. The first one is about, you talked about U.S. pulling away from World Health Organization.
Yeah.
I think one of the things we need to consider when you think about health is a very intertwined connection, very close relationship between health and nutrition. So one way to deal with health issues is not actually to manufacture pharmaceuticals or new drugs and so on, is to make sure that the population is healthy. If the population is healthy, we are going to have less challenge of diseases. If you look at the greatest developments in longevity in the last 100 years, it was not about the blockbuster drugs. It was about basic things like hygiene, basic nutrition, improvement nutrition. So that's where Africa should focus on. If we made our people more healthier, get enough food, then health issues or health challenges will be reduced.
Okay.
Number two, it is true that we are talking about oil. But if we are going to use less oil, then we are going to move towards electric cars. But as Africa have the capacity, is Africa able to manufacture, to design cars that are electric? So let's do more research and development so that we don't keep on relying on other people's technology. We can have homegrown technology. Charity starts at home.
Absolutely, I agree with you on that. Thank you so much, Professor Xen Iraki, Economist, University of Nairobi in Kenya, and also Mr. Abraham Great, Public Affairs Analyst in Ottawa, Canada. We appreciate you, gentlemen, for your time.
Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
And with that, we've come to the end of the conversation. Thank you so much for staying tuned. I am Darshan Usman. Take care.